This wasn't a rap beef, and it definitely wasn't a movie scene. In 2001, on the set of Baby Boy, cameras were rolling, security was in place, and Hollywood thought it was in control, until it wasn't. A real street figure walked onto that set, straight past entourages and bodyguards, and an altercation broke out that stopped production cold. No headlines explained it properly, no police report told the full story, and for years, the details stayed buried in whispers. This wasn't about fame, it wasn't about clout, it was about respect, ownership, and a line that some people believed had been crossed. Tonight, we're not repeating rumors, we're breaking down what led to that moment, why it escalated, and how it quietly changed the way the industry moves, without the myths and without the hype. By the end of this story, you'll understand why a few minutes on a movie set reflected decades of cultural history, territorial codes, and personal principles, and how a man who lived his life according to a different set of rules stepped into a Hollywood space and reminded everyone present that some lines are not to be crossed. Before that moment on the Baby Boy set, Joe Felony wasn't a headline rapper or a Hollywood name, but in certain circles, his name already carried weight and caution. He wasn't someone who built a street image after success, he came from it. Joe Felony, born James Savage, grew up in environments where reputation wasn't optional, it was survival. After moving to Southeast San Diego as a kid, he landed in neighborhoods controlled by the Rollin' 40s, an area already deep into real territorial conflict long before rap labels started scouting talent. And this matters because Joe didn't enter music looking for validation. Music came after identity. By his teenage years, he wasn't known for records, he was known for presence. The names attached to him weren't stage personas, they were earned labels, tied to how he moved, who he stood with, and how conflicts were handled in that area at the time. That background shaped how Joe saw the world. Respect wasn't symbolic, credit wasn't optional, and crossing lines wasn't something you debated online, it was addressed directly.
Homie Donnie Ramsey moved down here from LA, and that's how the 40s came about. Donnie was an original Harlem Crip from up in LA. He came down here over to the hood. As I said before, he moved over to the coast when he first came down to San Diego, and then he came over here to the hood.
When Joe eventually found his way into music, it wasn't through industry grooming or image polishing. It came through writing. First behind walls, then through verses. Rap became a way to document where he came from, not escape it. By the mid-1990s, labels noticed something different. He wasn't chasing trends, he wasn't softening language, and he wasn't playing roles. Signing with Jam Master Jay's label didn't just put Joe on the map, it validated him in a system that usually ignored San Diego altogether. He became the city's first rapper to secure a major label deal, not because he fit in image, but because he couldn't be ignored. Even then, Joe stayed grounded in a belief that would later define everything that happened next. You don't take what isn't yours, you don't repackage someone else's identity, and you definitely don't blur lines tied to real neighborhoods and real consequences. That belief didn't come from ego, it came from where he came from. And that mindset is the key to understanding why what happened in 2001 didn't start on a movie set, it started years earlier, long before cameras were rolling.
Back when I was growing up, we used to have picnics all together, you know what I'm saying? Cripnics was like, man, it used to be some of the most funnest shit memories I got, you know what I'm saying?
Another thing about that right there is that when Cat got out, he was the first one to go to the pen out of our generation that we knew. And we was enemies when we first met at the store, right? But we became close friends.
By the late 1990s, Joe Felony wasn't just active, he was established. Not mainstream famous, but respected enough that his name carried meaning in West Coast conversations. And with that respect came something Joe took seriously: ownership. Not ownership in a business sense, ownership of language, ideas, and identity. One phrase, one concept became central to how Joe saw his place in the culture. It wasn't a slogan meant for marketing, it was a boundary, tied to where he came from and what that represented. So when Baby Boy dropped in 2001, Joe noticed something immediately. On the soundtrack was a track by Snoop Dogg and the Thigh-Siders, using a phrase Joe believed was directly connected to his work, his environment, and his voice. To Joe, this wasn't inspiration, it felt like replication without acknowledgement. And that distinction mattered to him. In the industry, borrowing happens all the time. Sounds evolve, slang spreads, but certain things, especially those rooted in specific neighborhoods, carry weight that outsiders often underestimate. To Joe, the issue wasn't fame, it wasn't charts, and it definitely wasn't jealousy. It was credit. He believed the phrase, the tone, and even specific lyrical elements echoed his earlier work without recognition. Coming from someone with a much larger platform, that imbalance felt intentional, not accidental. What made it worse was the setting. Baby Boy wasn't just a movie, it was positioned as a cultural moment, defining masculinity, street politics, and authenticity for a generation. And seeing elements he considered personal tied into a Hollywood product triggered something deeper than industry frustration. For Joe, this wasn't about a soundtrack credit line. It felt like someone telling his story louder than him while erasing his name from it. And Joe wasn't built to process that quietly. While others might have addressed it through interviews, tweets, or indirect records, Joe viewed silence as acceptance, and acceptance in his world meant weakness. So the situation moved fast. Once word spread that Snoop was filming Baby Boy on a Los Angeles set located in territory Joe recognized, the conflict shifted from abstract to physical. This wasn't premeditated chaos, it wasn't a publicity move. It was a decision shaped by years of living by a different set of rules. When Joe and a close associate drove to the set, there was no camera strategy, no plan for headlines, just the intent to address something face to face. From that point on, the situation was no longer about music, it was about lines, and what happens when someone believes one has been crossed. The Baby Boy set wasn't chaotic when Joe arrived. It was controlled, structured, exactly how a major studio production is supposed to look from the outside. Security was present, schedules were tight, everything moved with intention. Inside one of the trailers, Snoop Dogg was surrounded by members of his entourage and hired security. Among them were individuals connected to Roland's 60s, a detail that mattered more to Joe than the cameras outside ever could. Joe didn't approach the situation as a fan, and he didn't arrive as a performer. He walked in as someone who believed a conversation was overdue. Multiple people who later spoke about the moment described an immediate shift in energy. The atmosphere tightened, voices lowered, movement slowed. Everyone in the room understood that this wasn't a routine interruption. What happened next unfolded quickly. Words were exchanged. Not insults, but direct statements, the kind meant to clarify positions rather than escalate them. But clarity doesn't always bring calm. As more people crowded into the space, the situation compressed, physical proximity replaced dialogue, and in moments like that, control becomes fragile. Security moved in, the room filled, bodies collided, order dissolved. In the confusion, Joe was pushed back briefly, but adrenaline has a way of cutting through impact. According to accounts given later, he surged forward again before the room fully stabilized. This is where the story has been retold many times, often exaggerated, often distorted. What can be confirmed is this: the confrontation turned physical, and it happened fast. There was no prolonged fight, no extended brawl, just a sudden, explosive moment that forced everyone present to react. Snoop did not continue engaging, and just as quickly as it escalated, it stopped. A key figure stepped in, Snoop's primary bodyguard, widely known as Big D. His response mattered. Instead of allowing the situation to spiral, he shut it down immediately. That decision prevented the incident from becoming something far worse. Once the room was cleared, the fallout spread beyond the trailer. Word traveled across the set, additional individuals connected to nearby neighborhoods arrived. Production slowed, then stopped entirely. For a brief window, the illusion of control, the separation between Hollywood image and street reality, collapsed. Walkie-talkies went silent, movement paused. Nobody wanted the situation to expand. Eventually, law enforcement presence increased, and the moment passed. No arrests were made, no formal charges followed, but the message landed. This wasn't a rumor overheard online or a diss buried in lyrics. It was a confrontation that happened face to face in real time with witnesses who understood exactly what they were watching. Later, both sides addressed the situation the way artists often do, through music. Tracks were released, lines were drawn, narratives were shaped. But the physical encounter itself wasn't about records or streams, it was about presence, and for Joe Felony, simply showing up and being seen mattered as much as anything that followed. Once the dust settled on the Baby Boy set, the industry went back to business as usual. Cameras rolled, lines were delivered, production resumed. But in the shadows, things were very different. The incident wasn't just a minor interruption, it was a quiet reminder of something Hollywood often forgets. The real world doesn't bend to scripts, budgets, or production schedules. Joe Felony returned home knowing the narrative was already being rewritten. In tabloids, it became an on-set scuffle. In music circles, it was exaggerated to full-blown gang confrontation. Neither was fully accurate. For Joe, the story was about respect and credit, concepts that don't translate into sound bites or social media posts. The phrases, ideas, and framings he felt had been borrowed without acknowledgement had consequences.
Like a 2-song demo, and we took it to Jam Master Jay's mom's house out in Hollywood. Signed me to Jam J Records, and that's when Onyx and them was on there at the time. Right. So I ended up flying back home after I was off of paperwork or whatever. And he was like, man, we want to sign you to the label. So I signed with Jam Master Jay's label first.
Interestingly, Baby Boy's team handled it carefully. Snoop Dogg, already a major West Coast figure, avoided retaliation or public escalation. There was no lawsuit, no public diss track immediately. The message, however, had been sent loud and clear. Hollywood may control cameras, but it doesn't control identity. Meanwhile, Joe channeled the event into his music. New tracks subtly referenced the tension, grounding them in real-life principles. To his fans, it was storytelling. To insiders, it was a warning. Don't erase what belongs to others, especially when it comes from a place of lived experience. This incident also exposed a recurring theme in entertainment, the divide between street credibility and commercial production. In the streets, respect is earned. It isn't negotiated by PR teams or lawyers, and when Hollywood intersects with these environments, the friction is inevitable. Industry executives would later admit that the set incident prompted a re-evaluation of security, neighborhood dynamics, and how certain projects were staffed. In essence, Joe Felony's presence forced the system to acknowledge its blind spots. For Joe, the confrontation wasn't about fame or media attention. It was about demonstrating that certain principles, identity, credit, and respect, are non-negotiable. And in the broader culture, that message rippled quietly but firmly. After the incident, Joe didn't chase headlines. Instead, he turned to his craft. Music was his lens, his witness, and his platform. In songs released post-Baby Boy, he referenced authority, boundaries, and the consequences of crossing them. The lyrics were layered, understandable to anyone, but carrying deeper meaning for those who knew the context. These tracks weren't diss records in the traditional sense. They were narrative pieces. Each line reflected lessons from the streets, encounters with the industry, and the complexities of navigating both worlds simultaneously. Listeners who understood the subtext recognized a recurring motif. Authenticity cannot be manufactured, it cannot be borrowed, and it certainly cannot be stolen without consequence. What's fascinating is how these songs resonated beyond Joe's immediate circle. Artists across the West Coast began incorporating similar principles into their music. Themes of respect, ownership, and standing one's ground became embedded in a broader cultural lexicon. Joe's approach also emphasized nuance. Unlike headline-driven beefs, his tracks didn't openly call out names. Instead, they framed stories, leaving room for interpretation, but ensuring the core message was clear to those who needed to hear it. In a way, his music became a case study for how real-life experiences can translate into art without exaggeration, hype, or distortion. For Joe, legacy wasn't about fame, it was about narrative integrity. The incident left a lasting impression on Hollywood and the West Coast rap scene. Production teams began recognizing that authenticity couldn't be faked, and neighborhood dynamics couldn't be ignored. Security protocols were revised, schedules adjusted, and dialogue around cultural respect intensified. For other artists, Joe Felony became a symbol, someone who understood that visibility doesn't equal authority, and presence doesn't equate to control. Influence, credibility, and respect had to be earned, sometimes outside the spotlight, sometimes in ways the cameras couldn't capture. Snoop Dogg, while maintaining mainstream success, subtly acknowledged the need for boundaries between commercial ventures and the cultures they borrow from. Interviews later hinted at respect for voices that may not dominate charts, but define authenticity. For fans, these lessons were less explicit, but deeply impactful. The story challenged the idea that music and culture exist in isolation from real-world codes. It showed that actions, decisions, and respect extend far beyond the studio.
Years later, Joe Felony's influence is visible in subtle ways across West Coast hip-hop. From lyrical themes to the cautious handling of neighborhood ties and projects, artists who grew up watching or hearing about the Baby Boy incident adopted a careful balance. They learned that visibility does not replace accountability. Fame does not erase principles, and industry structures can't substitute for lived experience. Joe's narrative continues to inspire artists and fans alike. Respect, originality, and authenticity, lessons emphasized in those critical moments, remain central to the culture's evolution.
Several years after the fact, those present on the Baby Boy set shared insights. Cameramen recalled the tension, how the atmosphere changed instantly when Joe walked in. Security personnel admitted it was the closest they'd seen a production moment slip beyond control. Entourage members described Joe's demeanor as composed but firm, not aggressive but unwavering. His objective wasn't to escalate, it was to assert presence and make a point. Certain principles can't be ignored. These accounts, verified by multiple independent witnesses, paint a consistent picture. The incident was brief, explosive, and meaningful, leaving an imprint on everyone present. The Baby Boy incident could have been forgotten as a footnote, buried in celebrity gossip. Instead, it became a lesson, a story of authenticity, boundaries, and respect. Joe Felony's actions, grounded in personal principles and cultural awareness, resonated beyond the moment. Artists, fans, and industry insiders learned that presence, credibility, and respect cannot be manufactured, they must be demonstrated. Today, the incident is referenced less for drama and more for insight. It reminds the music and film industries that art intersects with life in complex ways. Lines drawn in lyrics, phrases, or neighborhood culture matter, and those who inhabit those lines will defend them, not for fame, but for principle. Joe Felony continues to release music, mentor young artists, and remind the culture that authenticity is non-negotiable. The Baby Boy set became more than a location. It became a symbol of the collision between commercial power and real-life authority. By revisiting this story, we don't just recall an on-set scuffle, we understand the intricate balance between street codes and industry expectations, and how one man's adherence to principle sent a ripple across music, culture, and Hollywood itself. In the end, it wasn't about headlines, fame, or controversy. It was about respect. And that is the legacy Joe Felony left on a set that thought it controlled everything, only to discover some rules operate beyond cameras, beyond scripts, and beyond fame itself.